A rainy evening in Victorian England. Very boring history style, sleep friendly. This recording is not meant to entertain. It is not designed to surprise or excite. Nothing important is about to happen. What follows is a slow historical description of an ordinary evening during the Victorian era in England. It focuses on routine, repetition, and the quiet details of daily life. There are no heroes in this account. There are no dramatic events. There is no lesson to learn. Only time passes. The Victorian period lasted for many years, and most of those years were made up of evenings like this one. Evenings defined not by events, but by familiarity. Rain was common. Darkness arrived early. Life slowed down. This particular evening could have taken place in almost any city in England. The exact date does not matter. The people living through it would not have considered it special enough to remember. Gas lamps were still in use. Electric light has not yet become part of daily life. Sound traveled freely through streets and thin walls. People are measured time by clocks, church bells, and habits. There were no screens to check. No urgent messages waiting. Most evenings followed the same pattern. Work ended. Shops closed. Families went indoors. Weather often provided the background, and rain was one of the most familiar sounds of all. It fell without purpose and without change, covering roofs, streets, and windows in the same quiet way night after night. This story does not move quickly. Descriptions will repeat. Moments will stretch. Details will remain ordinary. The intention is to reflect how time actually felt during a Victorian evening, slow, predictable, and uneventful. You do not need to focus on every word. You do not need to imagine every detail clearly. The tone will remain neutral. The pace will remain steady. If you are listening, you may begin to notice the rhythm of the sentences, the pauses between ideas, and the consistent calm of the setting. Nothing will demand your attention. You may simply let the description continue, one small detail at a time, as the evening settles in. This is a rainy evening in Victorian England. And it will take its time. A rainy evening in Victorian England. Very boring history style, sleep friendly. The rain began slowly. It was not sudden. There was no thunder. No sharp sound. At first, it was only a light mist in the air, barely noticed by those walking along the narrow streets of Victorian England. The year did not matter much. It could have been 1872. Or 1859. Life changed very little from one year to the next. The sky was gray. Not dark yet. Just tired. Clouds hung low above the city, pressing down gently, as if they had nowhere else to go. The streets were narrow and uneven. Made of stone. Worn down by decades of feet, wheels, and weather. Rain touched the stone and stayed there. Small pools formed in the shallow dips of the road. They did not move quickly. Nothing moved quickly. Gas lamps stood at regular distances along the street. They were already lit, even though the evening had only begun. The glow was soft. Yellow. Weak. Each lamp created a small circle of light on the wet ground below it. Outside that circle, the street returned to shadow. A man walked slowly past one of the lamps. He wore a dark coat. Not new. Not old enough to draw attention. Just practical. His hat was pulled low to keep the rain from his face. He did not hurry. There was no reason to hurry in Victorian England during the evening hours. Time passed at its own slow pace. Carriages rolled by from time to time. Their wheels made a dull sound against the wet stone. Not loud. Not interesting. The horses did not move fast either. They understood the road. Wet stone was dangerous. So they walked carefully. The sound of rain became steady. Tap. It landed on rooftops. On windowsills. On umbrellas made from thick cloth. Shop windows reflected the light of the gas lamps. Inside, shelves were full but quiet. Many shops were closing for the day. A shopkeeper turned a sign from open to closed. He did it without ceremony. Without thought. This was routine. Everything in Victorian England followed routine. Inside nearby homes, curtains were drawn. Not to block danger. Only to keep warmth inside. Coal fires burned slowly in fireplaces. Not roaring. Just enough. Families gathered, not to talk much, but to exist together in the same room. Tea was poured. Steam rose briefly. Then disappeared. No radios played. No phones rang. No screens glowed. Only rain. The rain did not stop. It had no reason to. It simply continued, filling the evening with a quiet sameness. A clock chimed somewhere in the distance. 6 o'clock. Or maybe 7. It did not matter. The evening had arrived. And it would take its time. The rain began without an announcement. There was no sudden change in the sky. No sound marked the moment it started. It simply arrived, as many things did in Victorian England. At first, the rain was thin and almost invisible, drifting downward through the air and settling quietly onto the stone streets below. The city did not react, it had seen rain like this many times before. The streets were narrow and worn. Stone blocks formed the road, each one shaped slightly differently from the next after years of use. Water collected between them, filling shallow spaces where feet and carriage wheels had passed again and again. The evening air was cool but not cold. It carried the faint smell of wet stone, coal smoke, and damp fabric. These smells were common and familiar, blending into a single background presence that few people noticed. Gas lamps lined the streets at steady intervals. They stood tall and unmoving, their metal frames darkened by age and soot. Each lamp was already lit, even though full darkness had not yet arrived. The light they produced was soft and yellow. It did not travel far. Instead, it rested gently on the wet ground beneath, forming small pools of brightness that reflected in the rainwater below. Between the lamps, the street faded into shadow. A man walked alone along one side of the road. His footsteps were slow and regular. He wore a heavy coat designed to last many seasons. The fabric absorbed rain, growing darker as the moisture settled in. His hat was plain and pulled low. He did not look up at the sky. There was no reason to. Rain was expected. People in Victorian England planned for rain the same way they planned for nightfall. It was part of the rhythm of life. Carriages passed from time to time, moving carefully across the slick surface. The wheels made a low, repetitive sound as they rolled over stone. Horses walked at a measured pace, their hooves striking the ground with soft, careful steps. Drivers held the reins loosely, guiding their horses without urgency. Evening travel did not demand speed. Most destinations were already close, and those farther away would still be there tomorrow. Shop windows glowed faintly from within. Inside, shelves were neatly arranged with goods that had not changed much over the years. Cloth, tools, books, and household items sat patiently where they had been placed. Some shopkeepers were preparing to close. A man reached for the door and turned the sign from "open" to "closed" with a practiced motion. He locked the door slowly, checking it once more before stepping away. Business hours ended quietly. There was no rush of the last customers. Rain traced thin lines down glass panes. Inside the shops, lamps flickered gently, responding to small movements in the air. Outside, reflections stretched across the pavement, breaking apart with each ripple caused by falling drops. In nearby houses, curtains were drawn across windows. Families gathered indoors, not for entertainment, but for warmth and habit. Coal fires burned low in fireplaces, producing steady heat without much light. The sound of rain mixed with the soft crackle of coal. Tea kettles were lifted and set down. Cups were filled. The ritual happened countless times across the city, repeated in homes that looked almost identical to one another. Conversation was limited. Evening talk did not carry much urgency. Topics were familiar and often repeated. Work, weather, small observations of the day. When silence returned, no one felt the need to fill it. There were no radios to hum. No televisions to glow. No devices to interrupt the room. Only the sound of rain against rooftops and windows. Clocks were mounted on walls or placed on shelves. Their ticking blended into the background. Occasionally, one would chime, marking the passing of an hour. 6. Then 7. Perhaps 8. Time moved slowly, but it moved forward. Outside, the rain continued at a steady pace. Not heavier. Not lighter. Just constant. A stray cat sheltered beneath a carriage step, waiting patiently for conditions to improve. It did not seem concerned. It had waited out rain before. Street sounds grew fewer as the evening progressed. Foot traffic thinned. Shops remained closed. Lamps continued their quiet work, standing watch over empty stretches of road. The city did not sleep yet. But it began to rest. Water pooled along the edges of the street, flowing gently toward drains that had been cut into the stone long ago. Everything followed paths worn by repetition. Nothing rushed. Nothing surprised. This was a rainy evening in Victorian England. And it was exactly the same as many that had come before it. The rain showed no sign of ending. It remained consistent, falling at the same quiet pace, as if it had chosen a single speed and found no need to change it. Drops fell from roof edges in steady lines, landing on stone below with soft, unremarkable sounds. Along the narrower streets, water flowed slowly toward the gutters. These channels had been carved into the road years earlier. They worked without attention, carrying rain away one small stream at a time. Most people stayed indoors now. Those still outside walked with their heads slightly lowered. Not in discomfort, but in acceptance. Rain was expected. It did not require reaction. Doorways provided brief shelter. Some buildings had shallow overhangs, just enough to keep rain from falling directly at the threshold. These small architectural details existed everywhere, shaped by long familiarity with wet weather. Inside one modest home, a wooden table sat near the center of the main room. Its surface bore marks from years of use. Scratches, dents, and uneven coloration were common features, not flaws. A single lamp rested on the table. Its flame was steady, protected from drafts by a glass cover. Light spread slowly across the room, touching chairs, walls, and the edge of a cabinet. The walls were plain. Decoration was minimal. Practicality guided most household choices. A man sat in one of the chairs, reading by lamplight. The book was not new. Its pages were yellowed and soft at the edges. He turned each page carefully, not from curiosity, but from habit. The room remained quiet. In another part of the city, a row of houses stood side by side, nearly identical in shape. Rain ran down their brick fronts in darkened streaks, marking time in a visible way. Chimneys released thin lines of smoke that blended into the low clouds above. The air held it briefly before letting it fade. Street lamps continued to glow. Their glass surfaces collected moisture, causing the light to blur and soften further. Reflections on the road stretched and trembled with every raindrop. A carriage passed through the intersection, its presence announced only by the dull sound of its wheels. There was no conversation from inside. Curtains blocked the view, keeping the interior private and still. Clocks across the city ticked at slightly different speeds. No two agreed completely. Accuracy mattered less than rhythm. Another hour passed. Somewhere, a church bell rang once, marking time for those who paid attention. Most did not. Shops remained dark behind locked doors. Goods rested on shelves, untouched and unchanged, waiting for morning. Rain continued to fall evenly. It did not grow heavier. It did not stop. It remained part of the background, steady and reliable. The evening progressed without event. People finished their meals. Lamps were turned lower. Fires were adjusted, adding a bit more coal when needed. The city grew quieter. Not asleep. Just slow. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing stood out. This was the nature of a rainy evening in Victorian England. Unremarkable. Predictable. Calm. And as the rain continued to fall, the city settled further into stillness, prepared to let the night arrive in its own time. Inside Victorian homes, the evening settled slowly. The door closed behind the last person to enter, shutting out the rain without any sense of finality. Rain had already served its purpose. It remained outside, continuing without notice. The rooms were modest in size. Furniture was arranged for practicality rather than comfort. Chairs stood where they always stood. Tables occupied familiar positions, worn smooth by years of use. A fireplace provided steady warmth. Coal burned quietly, producing a low, consistent heat. Flames were small and controlled. No one stared into them for long. Walls held simple decorations. Prints, calendars, or framed documents hung evenly, never rearranged. They existed to fill space, not to attract attention. Light came from a small number of lamps. One lamp was usually enough. Shadows remained in the corners of the room, untouched and unimportant. Family members sat where they usually did. Positions rarely changed from evening to evening. Movement was minimal. Teacups rested on saucers. Steam rose briefly, then disappeared. The tea cooled at its own slow pace. Rain pressed softly against the windows. Curtains reduced sound as much as light. Outside activity became distant and indistinct. No one checked the time often. The clock was visible, but it was not consulted. It would announce the hour when necessary. The early evening passed without structure. There was no clear beginning or end. Tasks blended into rest. This was normal. As the evening continued, activity decreased further. Meals had already been eaten. Plates were cleaned and placed away. Surfaces were wiped with practiced motions that required little attention. Some people read quietly. Books were read slowly, not for excitement, but for familiarity. Pages turned at steady intervals. Others sat without doing anything at all. Sitting required no explanation. The fire was adjusted slightly. One piece of coal was added. No one watched it burn. Voices, if present, were low and infrequent. Conversations did not follow clear topics. Statements were made and allowed to fade without response. Rain remained consistent. Its sound merged with the ticking of the clock, forming a background rhythm that did not change. In homes across the city, similar scenes unfolded. The same furniture arrangements. The same movements. The same silence. People removed their coats and placed them in the same locations they always used. Shoes dried slowly near the fire. Nothing required urgency. Outside, streets grew quieter, but inside, nothing changed. The interior world remained stable. This part of the evening was the longest. It stretched without definition. Memory did not record it clearly because there was nothing to record. It existed only as time passing. Later in the evening, lamps were turned lower. Light softened further. Shadows deepened but did not move. The room appeared smaller, though nothing had changed. Some people prepared for sleep. Movements were slow and predictable. Clothing was folded and placed carefully. Others remained seated, waiting for nothing in particular. Fatigue arrived gradually, without announcement. The fire burned lower now. Heat remained, but flames were barely visible. Rain continued outside, unchanged since it began. It did not signal the night's progression. It simply remained present. The clock chimed an hour. Perhaps 9. Perhaps 10. No one checked. In neighboring homes, similar preparations occurred at roughly the same pace. Entire streets synchronized without realizing it. Soon, rooms would be left empty. Lamps would be extinguished. Fires would be adjusted one final time. But for now, the evening lingered. This was the quiet center of a Victorian night. Uninteresting. Predictable. As the late evening stretched on, movement inside homes became even more limited. People remained in the same positions for long periods of time. Chairs did not move. Tables stayed untouched. The arrangement of the room felt fixed, as if it had been decided long before and no longer required thought. Occasionally, someone would shift slightly. A hand rested on the arm of a chair. Feet adjusted for comfort. These movements were small and did not interrupt the general stillness. The sound of rain outside remained unchanged. Drops struck the windows at the same pace they had earlier. The glass no longer drew attention. It simply separated the quiet inside from the quiet outside. The clock continued its steady work. Tick. Pause. Tick. Its sound blended into the room, becoming part of the background rather than a marker of time. People did not count minutes. They allowed them to pass. In some homes, sewing materials lay on small tables. Needles, thread, and fabric were left in place for the night. There was no urgency to finish anything. In others, newspapers rested folded and unread. The information inside would remain relevant tomorrow, just as it had been relevant earlier in the day. Nothing needed to be completed this evening. Lamps burned lower as oil was conserved. The reduced light softened edges and made the room feel less defined. Shadows no longer appeared sharp. They faded gently into one another. In the kitchen area, everything had been cleaned and returned to its place. Pots and utensils waited quietly for morning use. No one stood for long. Standing suggested purpose, and there was no purpose left for the day. Some individuals leaned back and closed their eyes, not fully asleep, but no longer awake in an attentive way. Thoughts slowed and faded without direction. Breathing became deeper and more regular. The fire provided quiet reassurance. Even as it burned lower, its warmth remained present. There was no concern about it going out. Outside, the rain continued to fall evenly across rooftops and streets, unnoticed by those inside. Entire neighborhoods shared this same moment. Rows of houses existed in parallel calm. Each interior differed slightly, but the rhythm of the evening was nearly identical. This was the most uneventful part of the night. Nothing happened. Nothing changed. Time passed quietly. Eventually, one lamp at a time was turned down or extinguished. Darkness entered rooms slowly, never all at once. Doors inside the home were closed gently. The sound barely carried. Beds waited untouched until they were needed. Blankets lay folded. Sheets remained cool. There was no anticipation for the next day. Tomorrow would arrive on its own. For now, the evening remained suspended between activity and rest. This was how evenings ended in Victorian England. Not with an event. Not with a conclusion. Only with quiet continuation. By this point in the evening, most shops were already closed. Wooden shutters covered windows that had displayed goods only a few hours earlier. Doors were locked with slow, familiar motions. Keys turned once, sometimes twice, without hurry. Inside the shops, lamps were turned down or extinguished completely. Shelves stood unchanged, holding items that would remain untouched until morning. Nothing inside required attention. Shopkeepers had finished their day's work. Ledgers were closed. Coins were stored away. The routine had been repeated countless times before. Rain tapped softly against shuttered windows. No one inside responded to the sound. Business hours were over, and weather had no further importance. The streets outside reflected the closed shops clearly. Darkness filled the spaces where light had once shone through glass. The commercial day had ended quietly. Taverns in the evening. Taverns remained open longer than shops, but even they showed signs of slowing down. Inside, the atmosphere was calm rather than lively. Voices were low. Conversations repeated familiar topics and required little attention. Drinks were consumed slowly. No one hurried. There was no pressure to leave, but also no reason to stay longer than necessary. Tavern keepers wiped the same surfaces again and again, not because they needed cleaning, but because the habit demanded motion. The sound of rain reached inside through thick walls and closed doors. It blended with the quiet murmur of voices. As time passed, patrons left one by one. Chairs returned to their places. Tables stood empty. The tavern, like the shops, prepared for closure without ceremony. Streets between destinations. Outside, the streets belonged mostly to no one. Footsteps were rare and widely spaced. When someone passed by, the sound faded quickly into the rain. Gas lamps continued their steady work. Their light marked the road without illuminating purposes. Pools of light appeared and disappeared as one walked past them. Carriages passed occasionally, moving without urgency. Horses kept a careful pace on wet stone. Wheels left temporary tracks in shallow water. The city felt larger now, not because it had changed, but because fewer people occupied it. Rain softened every sound, making distance difficult to judge. The streets felt empty even when they were not completely so. Movement existed, but it lacked direction. As the night deepened, even the remaining public spaces began to close. Tavern doors shut earlier than usual on quieter streets. Lamps inside were dimmed. Final checks were made without spoken instruction. Those still outside adjusted their pace. Some headed home. Others continued walking without a clear destination. Windows along the street were now mostly dark. Curtains blocked interior light where it still existed. Rainwater flowed consistently along the edges of the road, following paths shaped long before this evening began. The city moved toward uniform stillness, one street at a time. Eventually, the streets reached a state of near-complete quiet. Public life has withdrawn indoors. What remained outside was structure rather than activity. Buildings stood unchanged. Signs did not move. Doors remained closed. Gas lamps continued to burn, indifferent to whether anyone passed beneath them. Rain maintained its steady pace, unchanged since earlier hours. It filled the space left behind by departing voices and movement. The city was not asleep yet. But it had finished for the day. This was the public side of a Victorian evening at rest. Orderly, predictable, and calm. As the public night settled further, the streets began to feel fixed in place. Nothing moved unless it needed to. Even then, movement was minimal. A figure crossing the road did so without haste, footsteps softened by rain and distance. Gas lamps continued to burn at the same brightness. They did not flicker dramatically. Their flames were steady, protected from wind and rain by thick glass casings. Each lamp illuminated only a small area, leaving long stretches of pavement in shadow. The wet stone reflected light unevenly. Some reflections stretched longer than others, shaped by slight dips and rises in the road. These details were old, formed slowly over many years. At street corners, signposts stood dark and unreadable. Their painted lettering had faded with time. No one stopped to read them now. Taverns that had not yet closed reduced their activity further. Inside, the remaining patrons spoke less often. Silence filled the gaps between sentences without discomfort. Empty mugs were collected and stacked carefully. Surfaces were wiped again, more slowly than before. The sound of rain against the roof became more noticeable as human sound faded. Eventually, even these taverns closed their doors. Locks turned. Curtains were drawn. Lamps were lowered or extinguished. Outside, the difference was slight. The streets had already been quiet. A watchman passed along one section of road, moving at a steady pace. His presence was routine, not reassuring or alarming. He belonged to the night in the same way the lamps and buildings did. He paused briefly at an intersection, then continued on without incident. Rain collected along the edges of roofs and fell in steady drips from gutters. These sounds formed soft patterns that repeated again and again. Along larger roads, an occasional carriage still passed. These were fewer now. The destinations were familiar and close. Travel at this hour served necessity rather than preference. Horses moved carefully, responding to the slick surface beneath them. Their breath was visible in the cool air, though no one paid attention. Doors along the street remained closed. Windows revealed little. Whatever activity existed inside was distant and private. The public world continued to withdraw. Streets that had once connected shops, workplaces, and gathering places now served mostly as empty paths. They connected nothing active at this hour. Rain softened edges. Corners appeared less sharp. The city felt older at night, as if its structures were remembered earlier years more clearly once daily activity faded away. Time passed without a marker. No bells rang. No announcements were made. The night advanced on its own. Water flowed gently toward drains and channels. Its movement was one of the few visible signs of motion left. Street signs swayed slightly when touched by wind, then returned to stillness. The evening did not conclude with a moment. It simply thinned, becoming quieter and more uniform. Public spaces no longer expect visitors. This was how the outer part of Victorian life ended each day. Not with finality, but with gradual reduction. The streets remained. The lamps remained. The rain remained. And together, they defined the closing hours of a Victorian evening, empty and undemanding, prepared to remain exactly as they were until morning returned. As the night progressed further, the streets reached a state of repetition. The same view appeared again and again. Gas lamp. Wet stone. Shadow. Another gas lamp. Walking along the road offered no new information. Each section of the street resembled the last. Differences existed only in details too small to matter. Rain continued to fall in thin, regular lines. It touched every surface evenly, without preference. Rooftops, signs, doorsteps, and windows all received the same attention. Water gathered at the corners of buildings, following gravity rather than design. It pooled briefly, then moved on, repeating a process that had occurred on countless previous nights. The lamps marked time indirectly. Oil burned slowly inside them, lowering almost imperceptibly. No one checked them. They would last through the night as intended. A distant sound traveled once through the street. It might have been a door closing, or a carriage far away. The sound faded before it could become clear. Silence returned easily. Public notices remained pasted to walls, damp from rain and curling at the edges. Their messages were no longer relevant for the evening. No one stopped to read them. Rain softened the outlines of buildings. Brickwork appeared darker and smoother. Edges blurred slightly, giving the impression that the city itself was resting. There was no expectation of anything else happening. Anyone still awake indoors remained unseen. Anyone still outside moved without purpose. The streets did not react. They existed only as space between places that had already closed. As the rain continued, the city maintained this condition of quiet consistency. Nothing improved. Nothing declined. The night held steady. This was the final public form of the evening in Victorian England. Not active. Not asleep. Simply present. As night settled fully, the roads of the city changed their purpose. During the day, they carried workers, carts, and deliveries. In the evening, they slowed. By night, they existed mainly as empty pathways, connecting places that were no longer active. Rain continued to fall evenly across the stone surface. The road reflected dim light from gas lamps, forming long, broken streaks that extended toward the edges. The stones were uneven. Travelers moved carefully, already familiar with every irregularity. These imperfections were known and expected. Roads outside the central areas were darker. Lamps were spaced farther apart. Darkness filled the gaps easily. Movement was minimal. The roads waited without expectation. Carriages still in use. A small number of carriages continued to travel through the night. These journeys were practical rather than social. The destinations were familiar. There was no novelty in travel at this hour. Carriage wheels turned slowly over wet stone. The sound was dull and repetitive, softened by rain. Horses walked at a measured pace. They required little guidance. Most routes were followed from memory. Inside the carriages, passengers sat quietly. Curtains blocked the view of the street. Movement inside was limited. The ride itself demanded little attention. Travel was endured rather than enjoyed. Each carriage appeared briefly under a lamp, then disappeared back into darkness. Travelers without urgency. Those who traveled at night did so without urgency. Workers returning late moved steadily but not quickly. Their pace reflected familiarity rather than fatigue. Occasionally, someone walked along the edge of the road, avoiding deeper pools of water. Footsteps were careful and widely spaced. Night travel did not encourage conversation. Voices carried too easily in quiet streets. Silence was preferred. No one expected assistance. Each traveler relied on routine and awareness. The rain provided steady cover, smoothing sounds and limiting visibility. It made every journey feel similar to the last. Travel at night was predictable and uneventful. Roads beyond the city. Beyond the city proper, roads became less defined. Stone gave way to dirt and gravel. Rain darkened the surface and softened its edges. Wheels left shallow tracks that slowly filled with water. Lamps were scarce. Moonlight, when visible, provided limited guidance. Most travelers relied on memory. Carriages moved even more slowly here. Horses adjusted their pace naturally, responding to the ground beneath them. These roads connected villages and fields, places already quiet and still. Nothing along them required attention. Buildings were few. Sounds were minimal. Night travel outside the city emphasized distance rather than destination. The nature of night movement. Eventually, even night travel decreased. Fewer carriages passed. Fewer footsteps crossed the road. The remaining movement blended into the background. Roads became defined more by absence than use. Rain continued to fall with the same consistency as earlier in the evening. It settled dust, cooled stone, and maintained the calm. Travelers who remained moved as part of the landscape rather than in contrast to it. Night did not stop movement entirely. It reduced it. This was the nature of travel in Victorian England after dark. Measured, limited, and unremarkable. The roads did not sleep. They waited. Gas lamps continued their quiet work as the night deepened. They stood at regular intervals along streets and roads, unchanged by the passing hours. Each lamp was enclosed in glass, its flame protected from wind and rain. Inside, gas burned slowly and steadily, producing a soft yellow light. The rain collected on the glass surfaces, forming uneven patterns before sliding downward. This caused the light to blur slightly, softening its edges and reducing clarity. The effect was familiar and expected. Lamp posts showed signs of age. Their metal surfaces were darkened by soot, moisture, and years of exposure. No attempt was made to clean them beyond necessity. Light fell in narrow circles beneath each lamp. Outside these circles, darkness returned immediately. The distance between lamps felt longer at night, even though it had not changed. Pedestrians passing beneath the lamps appeared briefly, then faded back into shadow. The lamps did not respond. They illuminated without judgment. Gas lamps were maintained to last through the night. Their presence was reliable, quiet, and unremarkable. Fog settling over the streets. As the night continued, fog began to form. It did not arrive suddenly. Instead, it slowly collected in low areas and along streets where rain had cooled the air. The fog remained close to the ground at first, then gradually lifted. Buildings appeared softer through the haze. Edges blurred. Distances became harder to judge. Gas lamplight diffused further, spreading gently instead of shining clearly. Fog muffled sound. Footsteps, already quiet, became even less distinct. Voices did not travel far, though few were heard anyway. The fog did not cause concern. It was a familiar presence in Victorian England, especially on wet evenings. People adjusted without conscious effort. Lamplight hovered within the fog, creating pale shapes rather than strong points of brightness. Streets took on a uniform appearance, with fewer visible differences between one section and the next. The city appeared still, not because it had stopped, but because fog removed any sense of motion. Night sounds existed without pattern or purpose. Rain remained the most consistent sound. It struck rooftops, stone, metal, and glass with slight variations. Each surface produced a different tone, but none demanded attention. Occasionally, water dripped from gutters or overhangs. These sounds repeated at irregular intervals, creating small, unimportant rhythms. A distant carriage wheel might be heard briefly, then fade. The sound blended into fog and rain before it could be identified clearly. Gas lamps produced no sound of their own. Their quiet operation added to the sense of stillness. From time to time, a door closed somewhere nearby. The sound traveled only a short distance before disappearing. Night sounds did not announce events. They simply existed. In Victorian England, silence was never complete, but it was layered and calm. The combination of gas light and fog altered the character of the streets. Space felt less defined. Streets appeared shorter. Buildings seemed closer together than they were during the day. The fog softened every reflection on wet stone. Light stretched unevenly across puddles and shallow streams, then dissolved. Street corners disappeared more quickly. One could stand beneath a lamp and see very little beyond it. The rest of the street remained implied rather than visible. This lack of definition removed urgency. There was no sense of distance to travel or destination to reach. The city existed in sections, revealed one lamp at a time. Gas lamps did not brighten to compensate. They maintained the same level of light regardless of conditions. Fog continued to thicken slowly, then held steady. Nothing reacted to it. The late-night atmosphere. As the night moved deeper, sounds decreased further. Rain continued, but more softly now. Fog absorbed much of its sharper noise. The city felt enclosed, as if wrapped in a thin layer of quiet. Gas lamps burned lower, though the change was subtle. Their light remained dependable, even as oil levels gradually declined. No one adjusted them. They were designed to remain as they were. Public spaces showed no activity. Streets existed as structure only, not as gathering places. Everything present served a single purpose: to remain until morning. The fog did not lift. The lamps did not change. The night did not end suddenly. It simply continued. This was the atmosphere of a Victorian night under gas light and rain. Soft, blurred, and uneventful. Nothing concluded. Nothing began. The city waited. Working class and middle class evenings. A rainy evening in Victorian England. The evening did not arrive the same way for everyone. In Victorian England, social class shaped daily routine, even during the quiet hours of night. While the rain fell evenly across the city, the way people experienced the evening differed in small but noticeable ways. These differences were not dramatic. They were practical. They were routine. Among the working class, the evening usually marked the end of physical labor. Workdays were long. By the time evening arrived, fatigue was already present. Bodies carried the evidence of repeated movement, standing, lifting, and walking. When workers returned home, rest was not a choice but a necessity. Homes were small and functional. Space was limited. Furniture served for clear purposes and little else. Chairs were used for sitting, tables for eating or preparing simple tasks. Evening meals were modest. Food was prepared quickly, often consisting of familiar items repeated night after night. There was little variation and no expectation of it. After eating, activity decreased rapidly. Conversation, if it occurred, was brief. Words were used when needed and avoided when not. Silence was common and comfortable. The rain outside was heard clearly through thin walls and windows. It blended with distant street sounds, creating a steady background. Lamps burned low. Fuel was carefully conserved. Light was present only where required. As time passed, workers prepared for sleep earlier than others. Rest was necessary to prepare for the next day, which would begin the same way as the last. The evening for the working class was short and practical. There was no pause for reflection. Only recovery. In contrast, middle-class households experienced the evening at a different pace. NVM. Work for this group often ended earlier, and physical exhaustion played a smaller role. Evening time extended longer, not because it was filled with excitement, but because energy remained. Homes were larger. Rooms had clearer separation. Space allowed activity to be distributed rather than compressed. Fires burned more steadily. Coal was added without concern for immediate shortage. Lamps remained brighter for longer periods. Evening meals took more time. Plates were set carefully. Food was eaten slowly, often accompanied by light conversation that repeated familiar subjects. Books were more common in these households. Reading occurred not only out of necessity, but out of habit. Pages turned slowly, with little urgency to finish. Time passed gently. Rain outside still mattered, but its effect was indirect. Thicker walls softened sound. Curtains reduced light and noise more effectively. Evening activities continued longer. Sitting rooms remained in use. Lamps stayed lit. The clock chimed, and the sound was noted, but not obeyed immediately. Still, even here, excitement was absent. Middle-class evenings were calm rather than lively. There was no rush to entertain or impress. Social visits were limited on rainy nights. Most remained indoors, following familiar routines. As the night deepened, these homes also began to quiet. Conversations slowed. Books were set aside. Fires were adjusted. Eventually, preparation for sleep began. Despite differences in comfort and space, both working-class and middle-class evenings shared important similarities. Neither group sought novelty. Neither expected change. The rain outside provided a shared backdrop. Gas lamps lit the same streets for everyone. Fog softened the city equally, regardless of income. Both groups listened, consciously or not, to the same rain pattern striking roofs and stone. Time passed at the same rate. Class influenced details, but not the overall shape of the evening. All nights moved toward rest. All activity gradually reduced. Working-class homes became quiet earlier. Middle-class homes became quiet later. But quiet arrived in both. There was no defining moment. Evening routines repeated themselves across days, weeks, and years. They were not remembered individually, only collectively. This was how Victorian society settled at night. Through habit rather than intention. Rain continued. Lamps remained lit. Homes across the city slowly withdrew from activity. Nothing marked the transition except the gradual absence of movement. This was the shared experience of a rainy evening in Victorian England, shaped by class but united by routine, repetition, and rest. Contrast between households became quieter and less visible. In working-class homes, sleep arrived early and without resistance. Mattresses were thin, beds shared, and rooms often held more than one purpose. People settled where they could. Blankets were pulled close. Bodies rested where space allowed. There was no sense of ceremony in preparing for the night. Clothing was folded roughly or hung on pegs. Shoes were placed near doors to dry slowly by morning. The sound of rain remained present throughout the night. It filled the space left by silence. For many, it was a familiar signal that the outside world had receded. In these homes, the night existed mainly for rest. Middle-class households extended the evening slightly longer. Some rooms remained softly lit even as others were darkened. Lamps were adjusted rather than extinguished completely. Curtains remained drawn, shutting out the street. In sitting rooms, People remained seated without clear purpose. Reading slowed. Pages were turned less often. Books rested open in laps. Conversation reduced to occasional remarks. Silence filled the spaces between words without discomfort. The clock became more noticeable as other sounds faded. Its ticks marked time gently, reminding occupants of the hour without demanding action. Rain outside was still audible, but subdued. Thicker construction and distance from the street softened its presence. Even in these homes, energy gradually diminished. As fatigue set in, evening routines repeated themselves with little variation. Fires were checked one last time. Lamps were turned lower. Doors inside the house were closed softly. Despite differences in space and comfort, both classes shared the same downward movement toward stillness. No household remained active. The city, as a whole, began to withdraw from wakefulness. Windows across entire streets darkened one by one. From the outside, these changes appeared gradual and uncoordinated. From within, they felt natural and expected. Rain continued to fall on every roof equally. Class did not change that. Gas lamps on the street burned through the night, illuminating the same pavement for everyone. Their light did not discriminate. Fog gathered the same way along every road. Time passed steadily, indifferent to social distinction. The evening did not belong to any one group. It belonged to routine. Working class lives prepared for another early morning. Middle class lives prepared for a slower one. But both rested beneath the same sky. This shared rhythm defined Victorian evenings more than any social boundary. No one marked the moment the night fully arrived. It arrived slowly, without announcement. Class differences faded further as sleep approached. Awareness narrowed. Attention withdrew. Rooms darkened. Sound softened. Breathing slowed. The rain outside continued its steady pattern, unchanged from earlier hours. In this way, the evening ended across the city. Not with finality. Not with distinction. Only with repetition and rest. In England moved without urgency. There were no glowing screens to measure moments. No constant updates. Time was understood through habit, routine, and mechanical sound. Clocks played an important role in this process. Most homes had at least one clock. Some were mounted on walls. Others rested on shelves or mantels. They varied in appearance but served the same purpose. They marked time steadily, without concern for speed. Clocks did not rush. They ticked. Each second passed evenly into the next. The sound was predictable. Tick. Pause. Tick. Pause. Over time, the ticking blended into the background, becoming part of the house rather than an object within it. People rarely watched clocks closely in the evening. The exact minute was unimportant. The hour mattered only loosely. When a clock chimed, it acknowledged time had passed, not that something needed to happen. Rain outside reinforced this slow movement. It fell at a consistent pace, creating a steady backdrop that made time feel stretched. There was no change to indicate progress. no signal that something new would occur. Evening hours merged together. Letters were another marker of time. In Victorian England, communication moved slowly by modern standards. Letters were written carefully and received after days or weeks of travel. Evening was often the time set aside for reading or writing them. In working-class homes, letters were fewer. When one arrived, it was read more than once. The paper was held carefully. Words were considered slowly. Writing letters required effort. Ink was dipped and redipped. Pen strokes were deliberate. There was no erasing. Mistakes remained visible. Most letters contained ordinary information. Health. Work. Weather. Nothing urgent. Nothing dramatic. In middle-class homes, letter writing was more common but no less calm. Writing desks were used quietly. Lamps illuminated small sections of paper. Words were chosen thoughtfully. There was no expectation of immediate response. Letters created a sense of extended time. Past events arrived in the present. The present would travel forward to the future. Evenings provided space for this process. After letters were read or written, they were set aside carefully. Envelopes waited. Stamps waited. Everything moved forward at its own pace. Clocks continued to tick. Some chimed softly at the half hour. Others chimed more firmly on the hour. The sound traveled through rooms and then faded. No one stopped what they were doing when a clock chimed. It was an observation, not a command. As the night deepened, clocks became more noticeable. Other sounds faded first. Conversations ended. Pages stopped turning. Movement slowed. The ticking remained. In quiet rooms, it defined the rhythm of the evening. In shared spaces, multiple clocks sometimes ticked slightly out of sync with one another. No attempt was made to correct this. Accuracy mattered less than consistency. Outside, public clocks marked time for the streets. Church clocks chimed for those awake enough to hear them. Their sound carried through rain and fog, softened by distance. Most people heard them only faintly. Some did not hear them at all. Time passed regardless. Letters rested on tables. Clocks rested on walls. Rain rested on rooftops and stone. Evening hours had no clear boundaries. There was no sudden transition from one hour to the next. People prepared for sleep gradually. One action followed another without urgency. Clothing was folded. Lamps were turned lower. Fires were adjusted. Clocks continued. Even when people slept, time did not pause. Clocks ticked in darkened rooms. Rain continued to fall outside. Letters remained unread until morning. This slow movement of time defined Victorian evenings more than any single activity. Nothing interrupted it. There were no alarms to break the night. No sudden calls for attention. Only steady progression. In this way, evenings felt longer. Hours were not compressed by distraction. They expanded naturally. Time was not consumed. It was allowed to pass. This rhythm repeated night after night. Letters connected days. Clocks connected moments. Rain connected the city. Together, they shaped an experience of time that was unhurried and predictable. This was a rainy evening in Victorian England, measured not by urgency, but by steady sounds and slow movement. And time continued, quietly and endlessly, into the night. Deep night, rain easing, city fully still. A rainy evening in Victorian England. Deep night arrived without announcement. There was no clear moment when evening ended and night fully began. The transition happened gradually, marked only by the reduction of sound, light, and movement. Rain, which had fallen steadily for hours, began to thin. Drops became less frequent. The sound softened. The steady pattern gave way to uneven pauses between impacts. Rooftops and streets no longer received constant attention. Water still rested on stone and brick, but it no longer moved as actively. The city responded quietly. Gas lamps continued to burn. Their light reflected off wet surfaces, but without falling rain the reflections appeared more stable. Shadows remained fixed for longer periods of time. Fog lingered low, drifting slowly rather than forming actively. It settled into streets and alleys without direction. There was no wind to move it quickly. Most windows were dark. Entire rows of houses showed no visible signs of activity. Curtains were closed. Interior light had been reduced or extinguished entirely. Those still awake inside homes were silent. Sleeping had become the dominant state of the city. Public spaces no longer served a purpose. Streets existed only as empty pathways. Corners no longer anticipated footsteps. Doorways remained unused. Occasionally, a distant sound traveled through the night. It was impossible to identify its source. It faded before it could draw attention. The sound did not repeat. Roads appeared wider at night, not because they had changed, but because nothing occupied them. Carriage tracks filled slowly with standing water. Hoof prints softened and lost definition. Movement ceased entirely. Gas lamps marked the streets at regular intervals. Their presence suggested order, even in the absence of people. Each lamp burned independently, consuming fuel at a predictable rate. No one checked them. No one adjusted them. They would continue until morning. The rain paused more frequently now. Silence expanded. Where sound had once layered, rain, voices, wheels, footsteps, there was now mostly absence. In this environment, time lost clarity. Clocks continued their internal movement inside darkened buildings, but their sound did not travel far. Each operated in isolation. Public clocks chimed through the deep night, but fewer people remained awake to hear them. The sound passed through fog and damp air, softened by distance. The city did not react. Night routines had already completed themselves. Nothing remained undone. Nothing waited to happen. This stage of the night was not designed for activity. It existed only as time passing. Buildings appeared heavier under darkness. Their outlines were simpler. Architectural details faded from view. Rainwater rested along gutters and drains, no longer moving with urgency. Occasionally, a single drop fell from an elevated edge, breaking the stillness briefly before quiet returned. Fog absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Lamps appeared dimmer not because they burned less, but because their reach was limited. Space between lamps grew darker. Shops remained closed. Notices remained unread. Roads remained unused. Animals were absent. Even rats and stray creatures moved minimally, if at all. The city held its position. Deep night did not improve conditions. It did not worsen them. It maintained them. This was its purpose. Time passed without documentation. No one recorded these hours. They were not remembered. They repeated across countless nights without distinction. Rain resumed briefly, then paused again. These changes occurred slowly enough to go unnoticed. The sky remained obscured. From above, clouds held their shape. From below, they were invisible. The city existed within this enclosed stillness. Gas lamps formed a final layer of order amid inactivity. Their steady glow implied continuity. Even in complete quiet, systems remained active. Fuel burned. Clocks turned. Water rested. Nothing demanded attention. Deep night in Victorian England was not dramatic. It was consistent. It allowed the city to exist without observation. As hours moved forward, the earliest signs of morning remained distant and irrelevant. Until then, the city stayed exactly as it was. Fully still. Dimly lit. And resting quietly beneath easing rain. There were fewer changes now. The environment repeated itself without variation. Each minute resembled the last closely enough to make distinction unnecessary. Rain had nearly stopped. Only occasional drops fell from rooftops or ledges, delayed remnants of earlier rainfall. These drops landed softly, producing brief sounds that disappeared immediately. Stone pavements remained damp. Water reflected gaslight faintly, but without motion the reflections appeared fixed and dull. Air felt heavier. Fog remained suspended rather than moving. It occupied space without direction. Its presence softened edges and reduced depth, making distances difficult to judge. The lack of sound altered perception. With no regular noise, the city seemed larger and emptier. Gas lamps continued their steady work. Their glass surfaces collected moisture slowly. Light inside flickered minimally, unchanged by weather or hour. No lamp grew brighter. No lamp dimmed noticeably. Streets remained empty. No footsteps approached from either direction. No wheels disturbed standing water. No voices emerged from doorways or windows. Doorsteps remained unused. Handles remained untouched. Public benches, railings, and signs existed only as shapes within darkness. Inside buildings, sleep deepened. Those awake earlier had returned to rest. Beds were occupied. Breathing slowed. Awareness narrowed. Clocks continued to tick, but their sound was contained within walls and floors. The city did not hear them. Public timekeeping continued without witnesses. Church clocks chimed another hour. The sound spread unevenly, encountering fog, buildings, and damp air. It faded before reaching most ears. No response followed. Deep night resisted activity. Even the necessary movement had paused. Deliveries waited until morning. Work waited until daylight. Nothing justified disturbance. This period of night served no function beyond pause. Rainwater slowly traveled toward drains, guided by slight slopes in the road. Movement was nearly invisible, noticeable only if observed closely for long periods. No one observed it. Fog absorbed remaining warmth. Surfaces cooled gradually. There was no sudden change in temperature. The night held stable. Gas lamps maintained order. Their spacing created a predictable rhythm along the streets. Light. Darkness. Light. Darkness. Between lamps, shadow remained complete. Shops and buildings presented closed fronts to the street. Shutters, doors, and locked windows created barriers that would remain until morning. Paper notices loosened further from walls, damp edges curling slightly. Their text mattered less than their presence. Nothing was read. Animals remained hidden. Only occasional, indistinct movements suggested life somewhere beyond view. These movements did not linger. Deep night favored stillness. Even the weather respected it. Rain neither returned nor fully disappeared. It hovered between states, like the city itself. In this environment, time felt suspended rather than measured. Minutes accumulated without impression. Hours passed without markers. Night was no longer a sequence. It was a condition. Gas lamps continued to burn. Fuel reduced slowly. Clocks continued internally. Springs unwound. Gears turned. Buildings held their shape. Fog held its space. The city rested without intention. This stage of night required nothing from anyone. It asked for no awareness. It provided no events. It simply existed. Eventually, without signal, deep night would move toward something else. But for now, it remained unchanged. Quiet. Empty. And fully still. The hours before dawn did not announce themselves. There was no clear signal that night was nearing its end. The city remained quiet, unchanged in appearance and behavior. Darkness still dominated. Activity remained absent. Rain had fully eased. What remained was moisture rather than movement. Streets stayed damp. Stone retained cold water along its surface. Gutters held thin lines of runoff, moving too slowly to notice unless watched for a long time. The air felt still. Fog did not lift. It thinned slightly in places, but without pattern. Some streets appeared marginally clearer than others, though the difference was subtle enough to be ignored. Gas lamps continued to burn. Their light marked the streets consistently, as it had throughout the night. No lamp reacted to the coming hour. No flame changed behavior. Light remained steady. Shadows stayed in place. Deep night had softened into something similar, but not yet different. Buildings remained closed and unresponsive. Windows stayed dark. Curtains remained drawn. Doors showed no signs of use. Inside homes, sleep continued uninterrupted. The period just before dawn was not productive. It was not restful either. It existed between states, holding the city in suspension. Clocks continued their internal movement. Inside houses, ticking remained audible only within rooms. In many cases, it blended into breathing, into silence, into nothing at all. Public clocks chimed another hour. Few noticed. Those who did were already awake for reasons unrelated to time. Their awareness did not spread. Their movement did not follow. The city did not shift in response. Pre-dawn hours did not belong to the working day. They did not belong to the night either. They were unclaimed. Streets remained empty. No carts moved early. No footsteps tested the pavement. No windows opened in anticipation of morning air. Even animals waited. Birds had not yet resumed activity. They remained quiet, conserving motion and sound. The absence of rain made silence more complete. Without falling water, nothing layered the soundscape. The quiet exposed distance. Sounds would have traveled far if they existed. None did. Gas lamps created small islands of visibility. Between them, darkness remained unbroken. Fog reduced contrast. Edges softened further. The city seemed less detailed, more uniform. Walls, doors, and signs lost individuality. They became shapes rather than objects. Time moved forward, but without sensation. Minutes did not feel shorter or longer. They simply accumulated. In some locations, moisture slowly evaporated. The change was technical rather than visible. No surface dried fully. Nothing felt new. The sky remained closed. Clouds showed no variation in color or texture. No brightness appeared behind them. No hint of sunrise was present yet. This was still night. The city remained in rest mode. Systems continued quietly. Lamps burned fuel. Clocks turned gears. Water settled. Nothing required adjustment. This hour repeated itself every morning. Few people experienced it fully. Fewer still remembered it. It passed unnoticed. Eventually, conditions would change. Light would increase. Movement would resume. But that transition lay outside this moment. For now, the city stayed exactly as it had been. Silent. Dim. And waiting without awareness. Pre-dawn in Victorian England offered no spectacle. It offered continuity. And time continued forward, gently and without interruption, toward a day that had not yet begun. The city remained in a condition of near-complete suspension. Nothing began yet. There was no gradual increase in activity to observe. No early signals appeared. The environment held itself steady, as if deliberately avoiding change. Darkness persisted, though it no longer felt as dense. This difference was not visual. It was atmospheric. The night felt thinner, even when it looked the same. Moisture rested everywhere. Stones retained cold water. Brick surfaces stayed dark. Wooden doors absorbed dampness slowly, without reaction. Iron fixtures cooled, forming faint traces of condensation. Fog adjusted subtly. In some areas it lifted slightly, revealing a short stretch of road before settling again. These shifts were temporary and unimportant. They did not lead anywhere. Gas lamps continued uninterrupted. Their flames were smaller now, but only by natural fuel consumption. Light output remained sufficient. Shadows did not change position. Lamps still divided the streets into measured segments. Nothing occupied these segments. Roadways remained empty. No carriage tested the surface. No early labor crossed from one side to the other. No intentional movement interrupted the stillness. Sound remained absent. Without rain, without traffic, without voices, space itself became audible. The city felt hollow. Occasionally, a soft mechanical sound traveled from within a building. It might have been a pipe settling or wood adjusting to temperature. The sound resolved quickly and did not repeat. Inside homes, sleep continued. Those who slept earlier slept deeper now. Awareness withdrew further. Dreams, if present, did not connect to the outside environment. Beds remained occupied. Covers stayed in place. No one rose early yet. Clocks continued their internal work. Some were nearing the limit of their wound spring. Others moved effortlessly. Accuracy varied slightly, but it did not matter. Public clocks marked another hour. The sound spread weakly. Fog absorbed it. Distance dissolved it. Most of the city never registered it. This period belonged neither to productivity nor rest. It existed only as continuation. The night did not end abruptly. It faded gradually by withholding change. Even animals continued to wait. Birds did not sing. Horses did not stir. Cats remained hidden. The city's living systems remained paused. Water in gutters shifted slightly, guided by subtle slopes. The movement took minutes to complete inches. It was a slow process without destination. Nothing responded to it. The sky remained unchanged. No brightness gathered at the horizon. No color shift announced morning. Clouds remained uniform and heavy. Even if someone had been watching closely, there would have been little to report. This was not transition yet. It was extension. Pre-dawn hours stretched outward, repeating their conditions quietly. Every street matched the next. Every block matched the last. Individual locations lost significance. Only the structure of the city remained. Gas lamps continued to define streets artificially. They imposed order on emptiness. Their presence suggested normality even as activity remained absent. Soon, one of them would be extinguished manually as morning approached. But not yet. The city remained fully disengaged. Time moved forward carefully, without urgency or interruption. Nothing pressed it along. Eventually, something would shift. Light would change first, barely noticeable at the edges of perception. Then movement would follow. But in this moment, none of that was present. Pre-dawn held the city still, not asleep, not awake, simply paused. This pause was not temporary in feeling, even though it was temporary in fact. And so the city remained. Quiet. Dim. And unchanged. As night prepared to release control, slowly and without signal. It did not arrive suddenly. There was no clear boundary between night and day. Darkness loosened its hold gradually, without revealing much in return. The city remained quiet, still resting between states. The first change was not visual. It was environmental. Air shifted slightly. Moisture that had settled for hours began to cool further. Fog adjusted its position, thinning in some places while remaining dense in others. These changes occurred slowly and unevenly. Gas lamps were still lit. Their glow remained the primary source of light. Compared to the sky, they appeared unchanged. Compared to the streets, they continued to define space clearly. Shadows remained long and soft. Roads stayed empty. No immediate movement followed the change in atmosphere. The city did not wake simply because the morning approached. Water remained on stone. Pavement reflected dim light faintly. Gutters continued to hold narrow lines of standing water. Nothing flowed quickly. The rain from earlier hours had fully passed, leaving only its residue. Inside buildings, sleep began to loosen. This change was subtle. Breathing patterns shifted. Bodies adjusted position. Covers moved slightly. These actions were unconscious and unobserved. No one rose yet. Clocks continued internally, preparing the city for structure without activating it. Public clocks marked another hour. The sound traveled slightly farther now, as fog thinned in certain directions. Even so, few heard it. Those who did not respond immediately. The sky remained closed. Cloud cover prevented any clear color change. What little light increased was diffused and indirect, spreading evenly rather than forming a focal point. Streets appeared marginally clearer. The edges of buildings grew more defined. Signage became easier to distinguish, though still unreadable at a distance. Architecture emerged slowly from uniform darkness. Fog withdrew upward slightly. It did not vanish. It lifted just enough to expose the upper portions of buildings first. Lower streets remained partially obscured. Gas lamps continued their steady burn. Soon, they would become unnecessary. But for now, they still serve a purpose. The first intentional movement appeared indoors. In a few working-class homes, someone stirred with awareness. Not urgency, routine. A hand reached for familiar clothing. A foot touched the cold floor briefly. These movements were quiet. Doors inside homes opened and closed softly. No exterior door was opened yet. The city outside remained unchanged. In middle-class homes, preparation began later. Awareness returned more slowly. There was no need to rise early. Morning routines waited. For now, stillness continued. Animals were the next to respond. Somewhere unseen, a bird moved position. It did not sing yet. It waited. The city remained silent. A horse shifted weight inside a stable. Wood creaked faintly. The sound did not repeat. Still, no visible motion appeared on the streets. Gas lamps continued to divide space artificially. Their light now contrasted more noticeably against the sky. Darkness thinned above while remaining below. This imbalance created the first sense of direction. The city remained closed. Shops did not open. Doors remained shut. Windows stayed dark or dim. Only function-based movement prepared beneath the surface. Water in gutters shifted slightly as temperature changed. The movement was gradual and incomplete. Nothing responded. The early morning existed in preparation rather than action. It held potential without using it. The city did not wake as a whole. It would wake in parts. One street at a time. One building at a time. One person at a time. But none of that happened yet. Gas lamps continued burning until instructed otherwise. Fog lingered without resistance. Streets remained unoccupied. This hour repeated itself daily. It passed quietly. Soon, the first exterior door would open. The first footsteps would cross wet pavement. The first sound would mark the end of full stillness. But for now, early morning held its position. Not night. Not day. Just a gradual shift toward motion. Slow enough to remain unnoticed. Interrupt the city. It replaced the night carefully. Light continued to increase, but without brightness. Clouds filtered it evenly. Streets did not shine. They simply became visible. Gas lamps were extinguished one by one. The action was practical and unremarkable. No one watched. No one recorded the moment. The lamps had served their purpose. Fog continued to thin. It did not disappear completely. It lifted just enough to allow longer lines of sight. Buildings became familiar shapes again. Streets remained quiet, but no longer inactive. The first exterior doors opened. Slowly. Without sound meant to be heard. Footsteps touched damp stone and paused briefly before continuing. Movement resumed without urgency. Carts would come later. Voices would follow. Shops would open when scheduled. Nothing rushed. The night had ended not with a conclusion, but with replacement. Rain no longer mattered. Water remained on stone, but it would dry when conditions allowed. The city adjusted naturally. Clocks continued marking time, now noticed again. Hours regained meaning. Tasks returned. Routine resumed. Victorian England did not celebrate the morning. It accepted it. The city did not remember the night as something separate. It dissolved into repetition, just as all nights did. What remained was continuity. Buildings stayed where they were. Streets kept their paths. Time moved forward. This was the end of one quiet cycle, and the beginning of another identical one. Nothing was completed. Nothing was started. Only continued. And with that, the city returned fully to routine. Steady. Predictable. And unchanged.